So then, the format for this week is that I am going to try to deliver some knowledge on the application of the idea of a political ecology perspective, or using the political ecology lens to understand a specific case study. Now, in this case, it's Panama City. So I'm going to be starting and demonstrating a little bit of that work, and then after that, I'm hoping that you guys are going to be picking up that analysis yourselves, working independently, picking a theme that interests you, and therefore adding to my analysis. Now, as I've said, this teaching arises out of the research work that I've done in Panama while I've been based there, and my own thinking about it. And what I'd be really excited by is if we can, um, if you're interested in helping me push this agenda further. Essentially, if we can work together to create new knowledge, if we can apply the political ecology lens to Panama City to reveal new things. So to continue on that journey, I want to now start undertaking and sharing with you my own analysis. I want to start thinking about the drivers and the outcomes of political ecology in the city. Now, echoing the sort of the structure of the module a little bit, I want to start with giving you some information about the initial settlement of Panama City, and very much under this the idea of thinking about the built environment. Now, as you will recall, Panama City was first founded by a Spaniard, and he was actually sent by the Spanish king with a specific mission to found Panama City in the location that was chosen because of, as we know, the Spanish crown wanted to facilitate trade and the extraction of resources out of South America to be shipped up to Panama, using the new Panama City as a node, so it could then be moved across land and by water to the Atlantic Ocean, and then shipped back to the imperial centre to Spain in Europe. So this was the motivating force behind the building of Panama City. And I might have mentioned at some points in the past, so I'm quite an interdisciplinary academic, and in fact my undergraduate degree was in history and in politics. And during this experience, I developed quite a significant appreciation for the possibility of the methods of history and the knowledge generated by historical study to inform contemporary political understandings. This is where I got interested in international development, and we didn't have really the idea of sustainable development in my education and my curriculum at the time. But that's what I got interested in. But I always come back to the value of history and to the fascination of history. And I think by looking into the past, we often see things that we think might be quite modern and quite innovative and quite unique to us as a generation or to recent history. But actually, it turns out it's very much not the case. And people have often had the very same thoughts and reflections and ideas, maybe packaged in different ways with different levels of knowledge. But we see these things often a lot older than we might initially think. And here is an example that absolutely fascinates me. So De Villa was given instructions by the Spanish king in 1519 with specific details about how Panama City should be founded and built. So what we see here is the development of a codified planning framework, which I think is something that we probably wouldn't expect to have been started in the 16th century. Now, just to pick out the details of these, so the city was to be planned in a regular fashion, so with an emphasis on ensuring that, therefore, it didn't develop in an ad hoc fashion. It was an ordered place for appropriate living. The other focus we see here is that at the centre of the settlement should be a plaza, which would be a central site for the organisation of the urban political ecology, although not that they'd have thought about it in those terms. But we instantly see a social lens getting overlaid on this physical space. So this being a site for the church, and this tells us something about the way in which these people saw the world, their maybe kind of mentalities about the world, or their underlying ontologies. They believed in a god, and they therefore, the importance of appropriate worship and appropriate spreading of the word of God was central to their lives. They were a deeply Catholic nation, of course, and therefore this idea becomes central to the city, to the built fabric of the city. The church goes in the middle with the plaza, and then from here spread out the roads and things for other purposes. In this short quotation, we also instantly start to see the economic sphere, or at least what we would read as the economic sphere of sustainable development. So the city should be ordered so that extra labour, unnecessary extra labour and cost is not required in the building and operation of the city. Now, I would suggest to you that in here not only is the kind of the essence of urban planning and planning codes and instructions like you've done with Jonathan, but also in here we start to see the essence of people's thinking being very much along the lines of the three spheres of sustainable development. They didn't use those categories and they didn't use that language. But I think in here we see something that's a lot more similar to what we might be doing than we would previously probably give imagination to. And for me, that's a fascinating thing about history. Now, the first settlement was called Castilla de Oro. This is related to the title of the Spanish founder back in Spain. So we can also see another cultural connection here. But straight away, in the built fabric of the city, we can see the instructions of the king getting played out. Now, this is a model of the first Spanish settlement near Panama City, and it's, without going into the details, it's hard to know quite what is what, but we have a structure here that looks very much like it could be a type of plaza. Whether this is a church or whether this is a church, or maybe they are both churches, I don't immediately know. But we can also start to see this idea of a regular organized arrangement, at least in the central city. Outside of the city, we see, if you follow the arrow, some less well organized, maybe more kind of higgledy-piggledy arrangements. So the urban focus kind of dissipates over space, and the sort of the degree to which the planning ideas dissipate over space, which is exactly the way we'd see the development of a contemporary city. We know, or people built this model based on maps that were created of the original Panamanian city. And if you go to visit the site, as we used to do with our students out in Panama, we can see many of the ruins remaining that have been to various degrees rebuilt and made structurally sound. So we've got an idea that actually these weren't just ideas on paper. This was the way that the Spanish city was getting laid out. Now we also know that the city had a number of problems. It wasn't ideally placed in terms of its geography, but in 1670 the city was attacked and sacked by an English privateer. So he was an independent pirate, if you like, but he worked for the British Crown, the English Crown. And he, with his men, crossed the isthmus from the Atlantic Ocean and attacked Panama City to steal its gold, and in the process caused quite considerable harm and fear to the local population. But this event meant that the Spanish were required to rebuild their city, and they did so in a slightly different fashion to before. So here we have a contemporary map of Panama City, and as it's labelled here, Panama Viejo, that's the original site of the city. Spanish didn't rebuild on that location. They came all the way down the coast to this area here. This became then the centre of the new Spanish city that became Panama City, as you can see. Oh, I have no donuts. Now this is interesting because it actually coincides with a change in the ordinances that were produced by the king. So obviously, urban development within Spain itself had led into the development of these instructions. And between the initial founding of Panama City and then the refounding of it in the different location, the ordinances issued by the Spanish monarchy had been greatly updated, and they had a lot more detail. So the first thing to draw out here, we see again the physical space being overlaid with a social meaning. So again, the necessity of a central plaza, but in this case, the specifics are dictated that it needs to be appropriate for fiestas, for community gatherings, for parties. And we can specifically read into the Spanish culture here that it needs to be big enough so horses can be used. That also tells us something about the nature of the Spanish imperialism. So we can relate this to knowledge. We know that the Spanish introduced horses from Europe into Latin and Central America. So this is actually quite a significant specification. Moving on, we can start to see that the way that the street pattern is to be laid out is specified. So the idea that the corners of the plaza should face the four principal winds, as it's described, and therefore the streets that lead away from the plaza won't be exposed to these winds and cause what's described here as inconvenience. And I think this is really interesting because it shows that not only in 1573 were people providing instructions about urban development, but they were doing so with an understanding of the local environment, of the natural geographies. And they were thinking about how the human-created city might work in the most, I guess, sort of embedded way within these biophysical processes. And I think it's interesting to think about how this perspective compares to how we might go about building parts of a city today. We could indeed argue that, in fact, not just that very little has changed, but in fact, maybe the way we think about things has gone in a direction that's less useful as opposed to being more positive. And actually, maybe these ideas are kind of a more environmentally centric perspective on urban development is more appropriate, and we've kind of lost the value of that thought. Again, we see in another quotation, another instruction, a concern that the way the urban space is laid out is to help control for heat and for cooling. Now, in the modern city, maybe we don't worry about this so much because we have air conditioning or we use energy sources to create heat, and therefore we've lost that interrelationship between the planning and natural biophysical processes of climate and weather, etc. The specification for the cultural and social importance of religion in life is re-emphasized and given more details. So here the plaza, the central focus of urban life, should contain the cathedral and parish churches, monasteries, this sort of thing. And we note specifically that this is all about the effective instruction of religion. So this again gives us an insight into what was important to the people who are carrying out this project. But then we can see how that importance becomes embedded in the urban fabric. So I don't know if we'll have mentioned these terms before, but geography distinguishes a lot between the idea of space and place. So space is the physical arrangement of the surface of the Earth, or otherwise. It is an ontologically objective thing. So we can't think new parts of the city into existence. We build it and it's there and it is what it is. It has an ontologically objective character. But on top of space, humans are constantly creating and recreating the concept of place. Now, place contains the spatial underpinnings, but is about the social construction of ideas and meanings that fall on the top of that. So to take the example of a church, it is not just the space of a particular building, but because of the spatial qualities that are designed into it and the social meaning that's embedded within those qualities, it becomes a representation, and for many people, it becomes reified as the house of God, the place where bread and wine can be, in the case of some Protestant Catholic interpretations, and a place where bread and wine can be physically transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And this is the meaning of place, that social overlay, which we can agree can be very, very powerful. Place meaning can also dictate people's behaviours. So To use a different example, to think about the days when you used to go into the library, it is not just a physical space that has floors and books, but it is a place that has rules and norms and expectations. So if you go into the library and start chatting loudly to your friends, people will respond to you in a way that is conditioned by their concept of place. You could build a nightclub that looked exactly like the library, and you can imbue it with the place of being a nightclub, and people would expect you to behave in completely different ways at different times of the day, and you'd be treated differently. So our imagination of place is so powerful, and we can see it here in the focus on religion. We can also see that at the center of this urban development, there was religion, but there was also royal and more secular administration. So my Spanish history of the crown is not as good as it used to be, but I'm fairly certain that there was an idea that the king was or queen was chosen by God, and then there was a divine relationship. So the royal council chamber is positioned close to the church, as is the other administrative functions. And very interestingly, immediately we see also the customs house. So the place where the state and the state apparatus can generate income, rents and revenues from trade in order to support itself. Therefore, the urban space is designed right from the off in these edicts delivered by the king to the new founder of the city, that the city should be financially self-sustaining. So there's a political economy getting built in here. And wherever you see political economy, I want you to read political ecology, because all commodities and all services are essentially composed of environmental resources. They're ecosystem services packaged in certain ways. And we can see also here the concern for the poor and for the sick. So there's a social overlay, an element of social justice, the need for the state to provide for those people who are less fortunate. Now, it doesn't say here who is defined as the poor and what type of sick people get to be in these buildings, but we can see a concern. And I find it absolutely fascinating that in 1573, this was part of people's thinking. Also fascinating that they're distinguishing between contagious and therefore non-contagious diseases. Of course, the scientific knowledge was limited, but the fact that we've got health concerns being built into the fabric of the city, founded on the other side of the world in 1573, I think is absolutely phenomenally fascinating, and again shows us that really maybe not a lot has changed over time in the concerns that people have professed to have for the urban environment. The final thing I think here is the concern, and again an omnipresent concern for human health and for sanitation in the urban environment. So places that were considered to be have externalities such as slaughterhouses, fisheries, tanneries that were producing wastes and what we would define as pollutants had to be located so that their filth should be placed away from people's living and away from trade. So this is a long-standing concern with the standards of an urban and quality of an urban space. Now, for those of you that are interested in the interplay of ideas, an argument is made that the idea of the central plaza with the regularly arranged city is an imperial imposition. It was developed in Europe and by the planning in Spanish towns in Spain, and then it was transposed out into Latin and Central America and South America. Alternative reading of history is that actually the idea of a central plaza itself was inherent to indigenous cultures and the whole history of local indigenous planning and urban development that obviously existed before the Spanish came along. So if you're interested, this article actually suggests that far from being an imperialist imposition, the idea of the plaza is actually an incredibly nuanced and hybrid idea, which actually brings together ideas from what the Europeans would refer to as the new and the old world. And I think this puts a whole new level of interest on top. So we know that in many cases, the creation of place involves evolves in a way that adapts to other people's interpretations. So the Spanish may have been consciously adapting to local ideas, or not, as the case may be. So the debate is currently getting played out in the academic literature, but that's an area of interest you can take on if you want to. I just want to have a quick look about how this. So the second incarnation of the Spanish city was named San Felipe, and I think it was completed around 1673. It's known more contemporarily today as the Casco Antiguo, sort of the old town or the old quarter. Now you can see the map on the right, the square, indicates roughly the picture that's shown on the left. And just to help you with the orientation, it's looking out of the main religious building. So here we can see the ideas that were encoded and instructed by the Spanish ordinances about urban development. So we've got the religious centre. Also around this square, we've got the administrative secular buildings to be running the city and running the town and helping administer its function within the bigger Spanish imperial system. And remember this again being as a node of trade, moving resources from South America through across the isthmus and back to the colonial centre. So once you've got your physical built environment and you've got some sense of the kind of the priorities around around religion, around the administration, the edicts then started to make provision for the normal people. So here we have it described that buildings in the plaza itself will not be given to individual people. These are specifically reserved for the royal and religious functions. And it's considered a public space. So with Jonathan, you would have talked about probably the importance of public realm as a communal collective space. And this is not a new thing. This goes all the way back to the 1570s and beforehand. We can trace this. What we can see here in this quotation next is the idea that shops and houses for merchants are the next priority as the town develops, because it's recognised that these can contribute to the economy and the economic function of the urban space and place. So the specific mention there's going to be a moderate tax imposed upon these goods, and that will then keep the city itself running. It will keep it sustainable, right? This is all part of the considerations. Really interesting here. So at this point, when the Spanish are first laying their plans, it's not a market economy that decides who gets to live where and how land is used, but it's centrally allocated by the colonial administration. And we can see here that the priority is based on first come, first served process. So those people who initially arrive get to have the more prominent and advantageous plots and houses closer to the plaza, and everyone else moves back as time goes by. Something else that's fascinating in the urban development of this time, both in Europe and overseas, is the idea of common space and common land. Now here we have specific reference to the idea of there being sufficient space for people to go for recreation, which is, I think it's absolutely mind-blowingly fascinating. These urban planners were considering recreation in 1570, but also for the common grazing of cattle. So this is the cattle pasture. And I think we've talked about this in environmental principles, the idea that up until a certain point, there's basically enough land for large parts of it just to be common. You can use it and you can have it, and we can, as a community, define a certain part of it as the commons, and everyone gets to use it for their own benefit. Of course, as we know, as the human population grows and there becomes more intensive demand on that land and those commons, it's often the view of people that more stringent governance needs to be developed to assign and to understand who can use those commons for what. And of course, in large parts of Europe, the trajectory in which we've followed is sort of the enclosure of all common space. So you might be familiar with the idea of the agrarian revolution in Britain. Now that was only possible because of a process of land enclosure in which common spaces were taken away from the people as a collective resource and given to private interests. So this became the private property of a certain farmer as opposed to a collective resource for everyone. And this is something that significantly underpins the development of capitalism, because if you can't just go and find land to grow your own food anymore, you're forced into a market. The only way you can get food is to buy it, and the only way you can buy food is to have a wage. And this is what creates wage-labour relationships. What have we got here? So I guess sort of more practical considerations of the ratios of how resources are used. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the physical construction, just because I think it sets some nice background. So we can imagine that the original houses of the old town were built from stone and from wood, from resources such as thatch for the roofs, or slates for the spaces in the main urban centre. And we can also appreciate the idea that there was probably a continuum of urbanness. I don't think that's quite the right word, but the buildings in the centre would be most likely to be constructed of stone with tiled roofs, and then this would probably, as you moved away from the city centre, this technology would change. And I think this then speaks to the different kind of relationships of value that get established. So even though property might be allocated, there is still this notion of, well, what's in the middle, in the city centre, in what we might term as the sort of the central business district, is kind of most valuable and needs to be in the best condition.